individual that we're looking at with the cool red hat, that is Pico della Mirandola, and he's often noted as the kind of like spokesperson for humanism, where Francisco Petrarca becomes the father of humanism in the 1300s. More than 100 years later, Pico della Mirandola writes the Oration on the Dignity of Man, and this particular work is almost like a big shout out for humanism. And Pico, he's often called Pico because he's from Mirandola, just like Thomas Aquinas is from Aquino, so he's often referred to as Thomas. But Pico is somebody who's like, he's an aristocrat, so he's come from a wealthy family. He is very gifted. He speaks like a billion different languages. He speaks Arabic, Aramaic, Latin, Italian, and at a very young age, he can, recite Dante's Inferno, from backwards to forwards. He's got this really, really gifted mind, and so people are interested sometimes in what he has to say. He's kind of got a reputation. He also is a little controversial. He changes his mind on a variety of occasions. He follows some figures who get into trouble. So at a very young age, he's actually assassinated. So it's not quite known exactly who killed him. So, there is some backstory to Pico della Mirandola, but for our purposes, the Oration on the Dignity of Man, is really all about the great chain of being. So, if you noted that during the early class discussion, we kind of get this sense that he is talking about man having this like movement capability. So no more of this Middle Ages, lockstep, kind of stuck in the middle on the great chain of being, where man can move downward, can act like a beast. Man also in Pico's world can move up. And it seems as if Pico almost suggests that, man can be a divine or have some aspect of himself that is spiritual, right? That is going to lead to like new things and new potential for man. So, a lot of this is about man's potential. To some degree, he is talking about free will. He does talk about this potential as something that's individually moved, but also something that's maybe God-given or in some way achieved through the efforts of man. And Pico is really influenced by a few things. So one, he's influenced by a great number of Islamic scholars. He has been reading a great deal of the works of Islamic scholars, and he utilizes some of their ideas. He also is very influenced by Plato. So whereas we saw in the later Middle Ages, Aquinas very much a scholastic who's very influenced by Aristotle. He's got all of these logical ideas and syllogisms and if this, then this. Pico is very different. He is influenced by Plato, who in classical times wrote that every single object and idea, and person is kind of imperfect on earth. But there is a place where everyone has kind of this perfect form. So there's a perfect form of a pillow, of a circle, of a sock, everything that we're looking at all the time with our senses is like dulled and shadowy. The real perfect forms are elsewhere, right? And it almost feels like Pico's saying that maybe we can get to those. That's a possibility. And it's religious in some context in the way Pico's talking about it, but it's also very much a Platonic idea. So we see some humanists get cozy with Plato. If you're interested in more on Plato, go check out a YouTube video on the allegory of the cave. That will help you understand the way in which Plato saw the theory of forms. A few other things that we're going to look at today quickly. What led to the rebirth? So a really big question. If we argue that Burckhardt was right and in Italy at a certain point, the Renaissance happens, if we buy that that is true, what leads to this, right? What could be the context that creates the Renaissance? Well, there's a few different arguments. Think of it as kind of like a to what extent question. One argument is that some changes happen in Europe, arguably because of trade, and this comes from a variety of places. Maybe we heard from Mark Altaweel that because of the Mongols and the Pax Mongolica, there's a great deal of goods coming from Asia, into Europe, right? So silk and spices and ideas and merchants and traders and all of those people are coming into Europe and exposing Europe to a whole bunch of new ideas. Perhaps the Crusades even opened up a little bit of exchange of people and ideas, right? Some of the Crusaders making up the Crusader states, then move back, and maybe there's some of that. There's a little bit of cultural interaction that happens. We also know from Bentley that the increase in trade definitely happens, and one big example of it is if you look at the map in the picture, you can see Italy, and we're looking at a lot of maps lately of Italy, but if you check out where the yellow is in the area of northern Italy, some of the city-states that are there, and in particular, if we note Venice is a classic example of a city-state that gains a lot of wealth as a result of trade. It's a port city. It's not producing a lot of goods like other city-states, like Florence, for example, which is going to develop and have very high productive capability. But what Venice makes its money doing is by helping with shipping, moving goods from places like Egypt across the Mediterranean Sea, then through Italy and into Europe. And some of that wealth that comes from trade is setting up maybe the movement of the Renaissance. This leads to things like patronage of art and wealthy merchants who are going to have a certain role in society on a political level. And so some of that newfound wealth is a backdrop that is key to understanding some of the Renaissance ideas. Another big kind of influence is the role of the Islamic world. So throughout the 1200s, before that, the 1100s, even the 1000, early 1000s, you've got really significant contributions from Arabic scholars in the Islamic world. So the Abbasid Empire, the House of Wisdom, that huge movement to translate texts that were coming from the classical age. So texts like Aristotle and Plato and many, many others get translated into Arabic and ultimately into Latin and make their way into Europe. And they make their way into Europe, all of these texts, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're traveling through Spain, so some of the scholarship that's happening in Spain is moving then to Europe. In some cases, it might be traveling through Byzantine Empire. Byzantine acquired some of the texts from the Islamic world, and then after the capture of Constantinople, a whole bunch of scholars from Byzantine leave and go to Italy. So there's these texts that are like moving around the world, and something the Islamic scholars were known for is writing commentaries, really rich commentaries on a lot of the texts. So it's not only about what Aristotle said, it's about what maybe Ibn Sina thought Aristotle said. So the content that the Europeans look at is like especially rich, and that's huge. And to give you an example of this, you're looking at a picture of Ibn Sina, sometimes referred to as Avicenna in the West. It's a westernized name on a lot of occasions. He is one of these individuals who's like a, quote unquote Renaissance man in the Islamic Empire. He is playing a role as a medical expert, but he also weighs in on that whole debate that Thomas Aquinas does, which is about faith and reason. Ibn Sina tries to prove the existence of God much in the same way that Thomas Aquinas does, by using the logic of Aristotle. So even though we place Aquinas on the timeline in the 1200s in the European Middle Ages, Ibn Sina comes before him in the Islamic Empire in 1025. So some of this movement that is kind of happening in the late Middle Ages in Europe and in the Islamic world to kind of put together some of these classical texts are moving in such a way that we see influence during the time of the Renaissance. And then another really big influence, and we'll kind of note this in a way that we're kind of aware, everything that we're going through in our current context with the coronavirus and the changes, to pretty much every aspect of life. Very cognizant in talking about the plague that this might feel a little connected, right? We kind of get how people would respond to this. Just kind of note a few significant differences. One is the plague scale is much more massive. The fatality rate with the plague was likely to be over 80%, and so the way in which it ravaged populations was, in some cases, it had a mortality rate of about 60% of the population was killed, and that would be, for example, in Florence. If we look at kind of the mid-1300s, a very short span of time that the Black Death kind of came into society. It ravages through Italy, it ravages through London, parts of France. There are some parts of Europe that are very devastated, some parts that are less devastated, but the effects of the plague become really significant to this question about what led to the Renaissance. There's a great deal of psychological effects that kind of maybe get people to think a little bit differently, and there's also a great deal of effects in terms of people having greater access to supplies, in the 100 years that follow the plague. So, note a few things, and I know that because of the current context, right, not going to go into a great deal about every issue related to the plague, but certainly ask if you have questions. The plague is something that was bacterial, and it's believed, there's some debate about this, but it's believed that there were several plagues, so they come in smaller forms too, and after the plague of the mid-1300s, there's a series of smaller plagues that occur. But the plague that affected Europe mostly was in a bubonic form. This was traveling likely through fleas that were on rats, and so ships and perhaps areas in cities and the countryside were perhaps affected. And there's debate about exactly how this traveled and whether or not it started in Asia and moved through maritime trade across to Europe. There's a great deal of debate about it. There may have been separate strains of plague, but the form that people experienced was not something that traveled through a cough per se. It was actually something that was bacterial and traveled in the warmer months, and major symptoms were these buboes, lymph nodes that would swell to the size of tennis balls. In a very short span of time, people would succumb to the plague. And in terms of germ theory and hospital care, there is very little of that in Europe at the time. There is a role for physicians, so we actually see, in our modern current context, we see people walking around with masks. At the time of the plague, there was awareness that perhaps people believed that the air was bad. It wasn't necessarily the people, but the air was bad. So masks were worn, and there was a potpourri kind of inside the mask. So some people who were physicians, were protected in some way. But one of the things I'm going to ask you guys to do is read a short excerpt of Boccaccio's. Boccaccio is a individual who's Italian, who is somebody who's contemporary to the plague in Florence, and he writes a famous book known as the Decameron, which is a fictional story about people who experience the plague, but it gives us a sense of the coping mechanisms and some of the ways that people deal with the plague. Perhaps some of this could be relevant to today.